It was August 9th, 1943, and Major General Terry Allen's visage was gazing back from every newsstand in the United States. Time magazine had granted him its coveted cover accompanied by a feature extolling him as a commander of exceptional promise, one whose reputation grew more radiant with every triumph on the battlefield. Yet, a cruel irony lurked beneath the ink. By the moment those glossy pages reached the public, General Allen had already been relieved of his command. Merely 2 days prior, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley had removed him from duty. Allen had freshly secured Troina following one of the Sicilian campaign's most sanguinary clashes, preserving the 1st Infantry Division's unblemished record across North Africa and Sicily. His soldiers had successfully stemmed a ferocious German panzer counteroffensive that threatened to drive the entire Allied invasion force back into the Mediterranean. Yet Bradley dispatched him home in ignominy, citing lax discipline and a failure to enforce proper saluting protocols. Consequently, Allen found himself aboard a transport vessel bound for the States, even as the American press hailed him as one of the Army's premier combat tacticians. Consider the stark dissonance of that timeline. Bradley relieved the commander on August 7th. Time hit the shelves on August 9th, bearing Allen's likeness, meaning Bradley had dismissed the very general the public was busy anointing a hero. The optics were decidedly unfavorable, yet matters were poised to complicate further for Bradley as Army Chief of Staff George Marshall was observing the situation closely. Indeed, Marshall prepared to bestow upon Terry Allen an opportunity that Bradley never anticipated: a second chance. Terry Allen had first arrived at West Point in 1907, carrying a martial heritage deep within his veins. His father served as an Army colonel, and his grandfather had seen combat at Gettysburg with the storied Garibaldi Guard. 4 generations of his lineage had donned the uniform, yet Allen stood apart from the polished conventional cadets surrounding him. Afflicted with severe dyslexia that rendered reading a torment, he compensated through prodigious memorization, though academic pursuits remained an arduous uphill battle. He was dismissed from West Point on 2 separate occasions, a signal most men would have interpreted as a clear rejection from the military. Instead of seeking a new vocation, Allen enrolled at the Catholic University of America, completed his training, and secured his commission via an alternative route in 1912. The establishment officers viewed him with distinct condescension. He was not of their pedigree, having failed to earn his rank through the hallowed traditional channels, but Allen remained indifferent. He was precisely where he intended to be. He would dedicate the ensuing 30 years to demonstrating that academy marks hold little value once the shooting begins. The First World War transformed Terry Allen into a folk hero among the enlisted ranks and a persistent source of consternation for his superiors. By the age of 30, he had already assumed command of an infantry battalion. Disregarding regulations that confined commanders to the rear, he personally led patrols into no man's land, eventually sustaining a machine gun wound to the jaw during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The vast majority of officers would have gratefully accepted medical evacuation. Allen, however, persuaded the physicians to release him early, returning to his unit at the front lines while his wounds were still weeping. His soldiers were torn between inspiration and alarm, ultimately deciding that the situation warranted a measure of both. His commanding officers found him unmanageable. He consumed alcohol to excess and flagrantly disregarded any regulation he deemed nonsensical. He viewed military pageantry as a frivolous drain, on time better allocated to training. Yet his results were undeniable. Every engagement his battalion undertook resulted in an American triumph. Following the armistice, Allen transitioned back into the rhythms of the peacetime army. He drifted between cavalry assignments, finding trouble, and extricating himself from it, cementing a reputation as the officer one desires solely in the heat of battle and nowhere else. Then he caught the eye of George Marshall. By 1940, Lieutenant Colonel Allen was enduring a dressing down from his regimental commander, facing a potential court-martial for yet another indiscretion. Suddenly, a telegram was delivered. Allen had been elevated to Brigadier General, bypassing the permanent rank of Colonel entirely thanks to George Marshall's personal intervention. The Army Chief of Staff was meticulously reconstructing the military for a conflict he knew was inevitable. He required hardened combat leaders, not officers suited merely for the parade ground. Marshall noted that while Allen appeared unprepossessing and casual, he was an outstanding leader, capable of achieving anything with his soldiers. Other generals questioned Marshall's sanity, viewing Allen only as an inebriated instigator who had twice washed out of West Point. But Marshall perceived a deeper truth. He saw a commander who understood that victory belongs to soldiers willing to follow their leader into hell, not those who simply march in perfect formation. In May of 1942, Marshall entrusted Allen with the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One, granting him one of the Army's most prestigious commands. Allen was soon to encounter the man destined to dismantle his career. Major General Omar Bradley was the antithesis of everything Terry Allen represented. A disciplined West Point graduate, Bradley was methodical, cautious, and thoroughly fixated on strict military protocol. He held a firm conviction that rigid discipline and order formed the bedrock of any effective fighting force. When Bradley assumed control of the 2nd Corps in North Africa, he inherited command over Allen's 1st Division. The scene that greeted him was nothing short of repugnant to his sensibilities. The Big Red One's troopers neglected to render proper salutes, and their uniforms were stained with the grime of the field. These men engaged in fistfights within the rear echelons and viewed the military police not as guardians of order, but as adversaries to be scorned. In his reports, Bradley noted that Allen's forces carved a path of destruction through North Africa, marked by plundered vineyards and indignant local officials. Yet there was a crucial chapter he chose to omit. During the German panzer offensive at Kasserine Pass, while other American formations crumbled in terror, Allen's division stood as an immovable object. Whenever the 2nd Corps required a spearhead for a counteroffensive, it was Allen's soldiers who were thrust into the vanguard. Even Bradley was forced to concede, albeit with great reluctance, that no commander surpassed the mercurial Terry Allen when it came to inspiring men in the heat of battle. Consider the subtext of Bradley's assessment. Allen reigned supreme as the Corps' finest tactician, yet his troops' failure to observe military etiquette weighed far heavier in Bradley's estimation. It was amidst the sands of North Africa that Terry Allen gleaned a vital lesson, one that would come to characterize his entire military legacy. He realized the efficacy of nocturnal assaults for under the sun's glare. German ballistics and heavy weaponry transformed every forward push into a slaughter. By day, American forces were compelled to traverse exposed terrain under the watchful eyes of the enemy. But the shroud of darkness altered the strategic calculus entirely. Enemy artillerymen were rendered impotent against unseen targets, allowing American foot soldiers to bridge the gap before the defenders were even aware of their presence. Consequently, Allen initiated a rigorous regimen to prepare his division for operations under the cloak of night. Ignoring the Army's standard recommendation of 8 to 12 hours weekly, he demanded upwards of 30 to 35 hours, drilling his men to maneuver in absolute obscurity. They mastered the art of navigation, using only compasses and celestial bodies, rehearsing their offensives until they could perform them in total silence like phantoms. The fruits of this labor were instantly apparent. At El Gheta, Allen's nocturnal raids took the German detachments completely by surprise. The 10th Panzer Division was compelled to retreat, having suffered severe losses against fortifications that remained invisible to their sights. While Bradley observed Allen's triumphs mounting the persistent disciplinary issues, merely hardened his resolve to rectify the situation. The Allied forces launched their invasion of Sicily in July of 1943. George Patton stood at the helm of the American 7th Army, while Bernard Montgomery led the British 8th. Patton explicitly sought out Allen's 1st Division for the most arduous amphibious landing at Gela, confident that Allen's troops possessed the fortitude to succeed. Following their landfall on July 10th, they faced an immediate counterstrike from the Hermann Goering Division, which unleashed 90 tanks in a desperate bid to drive the Americans back into the ocean. Allen's forces halted the onslaught, prompting Bradley to later offer a truly remarkable confession. He openly wondered if any other unit could have withstood such a charge with sufficient speed to preserve the beachhead. Reflect upon the gravity of that statement. Bradley, the very commander who would eventually dismiss Allen, conceded that Allen's division was likely the sole force capable of salvaging the entire Sicilian campaign. Yet mere defense of the shoreline was insufficient to satisfy Allen's ambitions. He drove his forces inland with ferocity, shattering the German center and clearing a path for Patton to race Montgomery toward Messina. Despite his troops facing exhaustion and mounting casualties, Allen compelled them to push even further beyond their limits. On August 6th, following 6 days of savage combat, Allen's division seized the town of Troina in what proved to be one of the bloodiest confrontations of the entire invasion. That triumph at Troina ought to have served as the pinnacle of Allen's military achievements. However, on August 7, 1943, it instead marked his departure. Terry Allen was ordered to report immediately to 2nd Corps headquarters. Bradley awaited his arrival, and in a terse exchange, Allen was stripped of his command over the 1st Infantry Division. His assistant division commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of the former president, shared the same fate. The formally cited justification for this removal was a lack of discipline. Bradley argued that Allen had grown too individualistic to function within the cooperative framework of war, leaving Allen dumbfounded, especially given his division's fresh victory at Troina. Having emerged victorious from every significant battle across North Africa and Sicily, he was now being repatriated simply because he failed to enforce proper saluting protocols. Unbeknownst to him, Time magazine had already finalized their August 9th edition featuring his portrait prominently on the cover. He remained unaware that even as he voyaged home in ignominy, newsstands across America would be hailing him as one of the Army's premier combat commanders. His only certainty was the bitter realization that his career had reached its conclusion. Upon discovering Bradley's actions, George Patton was consumed by fury. Although Patton and Allen had frequently clashed trading insults over tactics and leadership philosophies and were far from friends, Patton respected the formidable force Allen had constructed, possessing zero tolerance for generals who prioritized salutes over battlefield triumphs. When Eisenhower delivered a lecture admonishing the poor discipline within Allen's division, Patton interjected before the assembled staff. He boldly corrected Eisenhower, declaring that one does not whip a dog immediately before sending it into a fight. Yet it was of no consequence. Eisenhower supported Bradley's judgment, and Allen's command was effectively terminated. The soldiers of the 1st Division were devastated by the news, for they were losing far more than just a general. The soldiers were bidding farewell to a commander who had shared their humble meals and patrolled their boundaries under the cloak of darkness. Terry Allen stepped aboard a transport vessel destined for the United States. He bore the appearance not of a triumphant victor, but of a soul who had suffered a profound spiritual amputation. At 55 years of age, the military establishment had deemed him a relic of the past, yet he remained unaware that General George Marshall was observing his circumstances with keen interest. On October 15, 1943, Terry Allen took his position before an assembly of troops at Camp Adair in the state of Oregon. These men were not the steel-tempered warriors of the 1st Infantry Division. Rather, they were conscripts and fresh volunteers who had yet to witness the fury of live combat. They were the 104th Infantry Division, known affectionately as the Timberwolves, a unit granted to him through the renewed intercession of George Marshall. A mere 2 months after General Bradley had pronounced Allen unsuitable for leadership, Marshall entrusted him with another division, a strikingly brief interval. While Bradley relieved the man of duty, Marshall bestowed upon him a fresh command before the administrative ink had effectively dried, sending an unmistakable signal. Marshall remained indifferent to Bradley's assessment. His requirement was not for a polished statesman, but for a tenacious fighter. Gazing upon the unseasoned soldiers before him, Allen perceived a wellspring of promise, resolving to construct this division from the very ground up. He intended to instruct them in the precise stratagems that had struck fear into the German forces across North Africa and Sicily. Furthermore, he aimed to demonstrate that Bradley had committed a grievous error in judgment regarding personnel. Instruction commenced that very afternoon. Allen proceeded to metamorphose the 104th Division into a fighting force unlike anything the Army had previously witnessed. Without delay, he re-implemented the rigorous disciplinary program he had refined to perfection during the African campaigns. Whereas conventional units prepared for daylight engagements, the Timberwolves inhabited the shadows, mastering the art of navigation, devoid of artificial illumination. They cultivated a language of manual gestures for moments when speech would betray their location, rehearsing assaults until every private understood their precise placement intuitively. Allen maintained an uncompromising stance on order, pushing his subordinates to the very limits of their endurance. Yet this endeavor transcended mere tactical victory. It was deeply personal, with every triumphant nocturnal exercise serving as a quiet refutation of the commanders who had labeled him unruly. He was tempering the Timberwolves into an instrument of war that Omar Bradley would ultimately be compelled to esteem. The division embraced a spirited creed: "Nothing in hell shall impede the Timberwolves." By August of 1944, their preparation was complete. Allen embarked his division upon vessels destined for France, returning once more to the theatre of conflict. The 104th Division engaged in hostilities on October 23, 1944, within the borders of the Netherlands. Launching his offensive under the cover of darkness, Allen saw his Timberwolves traverse 15 miles in 5 days across inundated terrain that had immobilized other units. Field Marshal Montgomery personally conveyed his commendations before the unit encountered the formidable Siegfried Line. Confronted by concrete bunkers, tank barriers, and overlapping trajectories of gunfire, other divisions had suffered catastrophic losses attempting to breach these fortifications by day. Allen's forces struck during the night hours. Consecutively, the towns of Stolberg-Eschweiler and Inden capitulated to their advance. Municipality after municipality was seized in the gloom, leaving German defenders scrambling to mount a defense against an adversary that remained invisible. They surged across the Roer River in a fierce nocturnal offensive, eventually arriving at the city of Cologne. The German opposition began referring to the 104th as the Night Fighters, with captives remarking to interrogators that engaging them felt inequitable. Unable to discern the American approach, the enemy felt as though the conventional laws of engagement had been suspended. By the spring of 1945, Allen's division had traversed the Rhine and was sprinting toward the Elbe, having evolved into precisely what Allen had pledged to Marshall, the most dreaded night-fighting contingent in Europe. Subsequently, they stumbled upon a discovery that would linger in their memories for eternity. On April 11, 1945, the 104th Division arrived at Nordhausen. They uncovered a concentration camp where 3,000 lifeless bodies were exposed to the elements, while another 750 starving and ailing survivors had been abandoned by the retreating SS. These captives had been compelled to construct V-2 rockets within subterranean passages, labored to exhaustion in the gloom, and discarded once their utility had ceased. For 6 months, the Timberwolves had claimed dominion over the night. They had utilized the shadows as both armor and armament, yet at Nordhausen they gazed into a chasm of an entirely different nature. This was not the obscurity of a battlefield void of moonlight. Rather, it was the profound blackness of the human spirit. Seasoned sergeants who had remained stoic beneath the barrage of artillery wept openly at the sights revealed within those tunnels. While Allen's soldiers had perfected the art of war, no aspect of their 35 weekly hours of instruction could have readied them for such mechanized slaughter. They immediately facilitated the removal of survivors to receive medical attention. Local German citizens were mandated to enter the deceased, and with barely 2 weeks remaining in their campaign, the Timberwolves pressed eastward, driven by a cold, righteous indignation. The date was April 26, 1945. Reaching the Mulde River, the 104th Division established contact with Soviet troops, distinguishing themselves as one of the initial American units to join hands with the Red Army. Hostilities in Europe had effectively concluded with Allen's Timberwolves having remained in combat for 195 consecutive days. Like an unyielding fortress, they never surrendered a single foot of earth to a counter-offensive, nor did they ever fail to seize a designated prize. This was the division entrusted to Terry Allen, seemingly as a mere token of consolation. Though they began as fresh-faced conscripts soft clay, compared to the hardened steel of the Big Red One, they were forged in fire to become one of the most lethal instruments of the entire conflict. Captive German soldiers consistently cited the 104th with a tone of profound dread. It was the American formation they wished most fervently to evade. The night fighters had carved their reputation into stone, though it was purchased at a staggering price. Close to 5,000 Timberwolves suffered the ravages of war, with over 1,000 brave souls making the supreme sacrifice upon the battlefield. General Allen took it upon himself to compose hundreds of missives to the bereaved families, each one a personal tribute acknowledging the profound depth of their unique loss. While Omar Bradley never voiced a retraction regarding his assessment of Terry Allen, the astute judgment of George Marshall had been fully vindicated by history. The commander whose portrait graced the cover of Time magazine just 48 hours after his relief from duty had now guided his 2nd Division to the pinnacle of victory. The alleged maverick who had twice stumbled at the gates of West Point had constructed the most terrifying instrument of night combat in the European theatre. Bradley had once posited that Allen possessed too much of a lone wolf spirit for the cooperative demands of coalition warfare. Yet Allen had demonstrated with resounding clarity that such distinct individualism is precisely the spark required to win wars.